Welcome to Sports Business 200 at Northern Kentucky University, our rivalry and ritual and international sports class. Today we're going to be talking about North American leagues and their international expansion efforts and what has worked, what has perhaps fallen a little bit short, and why we might see that with the sports that have primarily originated in North America. So first, it's important to again, think back to the British Empire and the impact that that had on sports crossing borders and sports development in the early part of the 18th century or the 1700s. So the list that you see here with India, Pakistan, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, West Indies, all part of the British Empire, as well as early America and Canada, as you see in the map. But there were some differences here in how sport diffused. In these 6 countries that you see in the top of the slide, what commonality can you think of within their hegemonic sports culture or their dominant sports culture? If you said cricket, you are correct. All 6 of these countries have cricket and rugby as well, to a lesser extent in India and Pakistan, as very popular sports even today within those countries. And they essentially adopted those 2 sports from their colonial ruler, Great Britain. However, in America and Canada, both cricket and rugby remain relatively marginalized, and instead, us and our neighbors to the north took some popular English sports and modified them into what later became part of our hegemonic sports culture. In the transformation of these games, baseball evolved from rounders, and our football and the Canadian version of football evolved from rugby. So let's talk about baseball. The first professional team, not just in baseball, but in all sports, right here in our own backyard in Cincinnati, the Cincinnati Reds. So certainly something that we can be proud of. We see an early picture of the Cincinnati Red Stockings here. The owners were the Wright brothers, not the same Wright brothers that started airline travel, but the third gentleman from the left there is one of the brothers, and just to his left is the other brother. And these 2 later moved to Boston and took the team with them, which is why we have the Boston Red Sox today. And that started the early tradition that we have here in North America of franchises as opposed to the club system that remains tied to a specific geographic location, which is what they're more familiar with in the rest of the world in terms of the structure of their sport organizations. And baseball also provided, similar to the way that soccer grew in popularity in Great Britain and Europe early on, baseball here in North America provided a venue for some of the working class people to come out and cheer on their neighborhood, to show pride in place, or the place part of their identity they got to express out at the baseball games, which helped grow the popularity of the sport of baseball relatively rapidly once it became professionalized. We also find it integrated into our culture quite a bit and into our language itself. Of course, we speak English here in America, our own dialect, and a lot of baseball terms we use in just our everyday language. Of course, if we think of the dating terminology that we sometimes use, first base, second base, third base, hitting a home run, or striking out, has its own meanings in describing our dating ventures with friends. And that, of course, is taken from baseball. And if we think even beyond that, we could certainly come up with quite a few other instances. For example, even in law, we see laws that are called 3 strikes and you're out, of course, based on baseball, and that law being if you get arrested or have 3 felonies, then the minimum sentence is a certain amount after your third strike, if you will. So just a couple examples there. And baseball's early efforts to internationalize was based on capitalism and Spalding, Albert Spalding. And you probably recognize the Spalding name as being a sporting goods company, which it still is today, and it was even back then. And Spalding had his own baseball team, and to help sell his sporting goods, he took them to Europe and did a kind of barnstorm type tour, if you will, playing games around Europe and trying to, in the process, sell his sporting goods. However, it was just mildly, if successful at all, in the aspect of spreading the game beyond just America, because the complexity of the game of baseball is perhaps a little bit too much to pick up just watching and perhaps participating in a couple games here and there, and it was a fleeting presence at the time. So where is baseball popular around the world? Well, if we think of the Baseball World Series, or excuse me, the Little League World Series, that gives us some indication because we're used to seeing certain teams rise up through the international side of that bracket. And typically those teams that make it to the Little League World Series come from the Caribbean or Latin America. You see some of the countries listed here. We also see a lot of major league players that hail from these different countries. Of course, here in Cincinnati, we have our own famous Cuban player who throws the fastest pitches in Major League Baseball, Chapman, our reliever. And also you see popularity of baseball in East Asia, specifically Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. And we see Little League teams coming up through the international side of the bracket from those areas as well, and of course we see major leaguers from those areas also. So I already mentioned the Little League World Series, which has helped grow the grassroots of baseball around the world, and the Little League World Series has been international since before 1950. And then more recently, Major League Baseball tried to, and has continued to try to create almost a Baseball World Cup, its name being the World Baseball Classic, first played, as you can see there on the slide, in 2006. It does involve 16 different teams from around the world, and it's played, I believe, every 3 years. So what are the barriers? Why hasn't baseball caught on as much as soccer and become as popular as soccer around the world? Baseball is certainly international in nature, but it's more international in different sort of pockets, as we just talked about. Well, one issue is that baseball kind of goes in and out of favor with the International Olympic Committee. It's currently out of favor. It's no longer an Olympic sport. And if you read in our chapter and were diligent in skimming through some of the footnotes, you notice that the authors mentioned that the International Olympic Committee is sometimes viewed as anti-American and gets in a lot of conflict with our United States Olympic Committee over television rights and different commercial ventures. And so there's this feeling here in the U.S. that maybe the International Olympic Committee holds that grudge against the United States and takes that out on the sports of baseball and softball in trying to maybe not keep them as Olympic sports. Also, cricket is certainly a barrier to the spread of baseball here in the U.S. Cricket is similar in some ways to baseball and creates competition in other parts of the world where cricket is very popular. And also we've seen youth participation rates decline quite a bit over the last 2 decades for both baseball and softball. At the same time that we've seen soccer youth participation rates rise quite a bit during that period. All right, and moving on to ice hockey. About 28% of the NHL players are international, which is very similar or very close to the percentage of international players in baseball, in Major League Baseball. Ice hockey also has regions of the world that the sport is very popular and part of the hegemonic sports culture. Of course, the U.S., it's one of our four major leagues, and we imported the sport from Canada, where it originated. And hockey got some of its popularity or some of its origins from field hockey, which is popular, very popular in most of what used to be the British Empire. And of course, the Canadians adapted it for the ice, and it's become their national sport. Other areas where it's part of the hegemonic sport cultures, as you might be able to guess, are all in the northern hemisphere and places where they have ice for a significant portion of the year. The highest level, most elite professional league besides our NHL is the KHL in Russia, the Continental Hockey League, spelled with a K. And some of our NHL players actually went and played in the Continental Hockey League during the most recent work stoppage in the NHL. So what are the barriers to hockey being more popular around the world? Well, as you might imagine, one of the barriers is climate. Hockey tends to struggle a little bit in terms of its popularity once you get outside of areas of the world where ice is predominant for a significant portion of the year. And another barrier is how well is the language of hockey understood. You know, that's a common complaint that I hear when I talk to other people who are maybe not big hockey fans, is they don't understand what's going on in the game. They don't understand that language of hockey. They don't know why play is stopped, for instance, for something like icing or offsides, or how the penalties are determined, hooking, roughing, things like that. And so that sport needs to be better understood for it to gain more popularity. But it does benefit in terms of its understanding from being an Olympic sport and being consistently an Olympic sport, unlike baseball, that is an Olympic sport for a while and then gets dropped from the schedule, as it recently has been. I don't think that there's much chance of ice hockey being dropped from the Olympic schedule anytime soon. Let's hope not. Now, American football. So the authors of our book, Gaming the World, make an interesting comparison when they talk about American football and its efforts to be more international. They compare it to religion, Protestant versus Catholic. And they talk about the rugby code of football as being somewhat like the Protestant religion, where you have all these different sects of Protestantism around the world, and you have a structure of the sport that's specific, or of the religion that's specific to the country. So you could think about the Methodists or the Baptists or the Presbyterians, and they're all Protestant religions, but all have their own different structures, similar to the way the rugby codes of football, which would include our American football, where our American football is tangential to rugby, or developed out of the rugby code of football, and the Canadian game of football is similar. You know, it has its own league structure, but it's only based in that particular country. Whereas association football, or what we call soccer, is more like the Catholic religion, where it has a global governing body, FIFA, that most of you recognize and some of you know well, that governs the sport all around the globe, and is also in charge of the sports governing bodies within specific countries. Similar to Catholicism, where the Pope is in charge of everything around the world, and then you have different countries in charge of cardinals or bishops in charge of different regions of the world, and they all report to the Pope. And so that's kind of the analogy that the authors made. In terms of specifically American football, the efforts to become more global go back decades, probably a lot longer than you realized as a student. It's not just the most recent version of the internet, what the NFL calls the International Series, where they play preseason and now regular season games in London. But back in the 1980s, or first started in 1989, and then the league started playing in 1991, was the World League of American Football, which eventually transitioned to NFL Europe and then NFL Europa. And was really a 16-year adventure. That it wasn't continuous play during all 16 of those years. They took a couple years off. Um, the World League of American Football originally had teams both in North America, some of which were here in the United States, and in Europe. Was kind of a developmental league for the NFL. Then later they did away with the American teams and only had teams in Europe, and eventually with NFL Europa they got to where they just only had teams in Germany. And we'll watch a quick clip here to give you some idea of the World League of American Football and its early beginnings. So that gives you some indication of what the early efforts of the World Football League were. And then now we're much more familiar with the NFL's international series held at Wembley in London. And I also have a short video clip that we can watch regarding that series. All right, so just a little bit of background there on what the NFL is currently trying to do after their leagues in Europe fell short or failed from what they were hoping to get out of those efforts. So what are the barriers to the spread of American football? Well, you could probably easily guess one of them, not a barrier that baseball or hockey suffers from, but there's no grassroots foundation for American football. Kids are not playing American football really anywhere else in the world except for the United States, and then somewhat the close version of it in Canada, the Canadian game. But other than that, there's not much of a grassroots foundation for growing up players in the game or developing players in the game. You also have the language problem in terms of in the parts of the world where association football or what we call soccer is called association football. You have that conflict, and so people see football as distinctly American, or this version of football, and to them, football is soccer. So they don't really they see it as more of an opposition to their version of football instead of something that could coexist with association football. Now, with the second globalization and the proliferation of media options, it becomes much easier for people in other countries to watch football via a mediated viewing option like the internet, streaming games live, which does help to people from outside the United States to understand the language of football more and become more familiar with American football. However, it also makes it less likely that a second-rate league would be successful there, because just like us in America like to watch the best of the best, in other parts of the world they like to watch the best of the best too, and everyone knows that in the case of American football, that is obviously in America, which is perhaps why the NFL has gone away from their earlier efforts to establish a league or a developmental league that has teams in other countries, because they recognize that those fans in other countries want to see the best of the best, and those leagues had failed in the past. And then you also have the issue of sport versus entertainment. So, yes, the London series has been wildly successful. The games have sold out, and sometimes relatively quickly. But the question is, are they selling out, and are those fans coming because it's novel and it's entertaining? There's only 3 or 4 games right now that they can go to. But if that was offered as a regular product all the time, meaning American football games, would it lose some of its novelty value or its entertainment value? And would people then start to come because of the actual sport and their understanding of the sport itself and the language, that sport as a language? So only time will tell, and it'll be an interesting experiment over the next decade or so to see what the NFL does next in terms of perhaps establishing a franchise in London, or perhaps a couple franchises because of the logistical issues of just having one. And moving on to our fourth, or our final hegemonic sport here in North America, basketball. Basketball is probably the second most well understood global sports language behind only soccer. Basketball is pretty popular all over the rest of the world, or in large, not just pockets, but large areas of the rest of the globe. And it's relatively well understood as a game, and there's many other professional leagues in other countries. And as we talk about the sport of basketball, I have to kind of tout my own team here, who isn't doing so well, so they need all the help they can get. The Detroit Pistons here. I got my Joe Dumars jersey on here, even signed there from when I actually used to work for the Pistons. Those of you that don't recognize the Joe Dumars name, pause your lesson here and perhaps Google him. He was quite the player, and actually was known for his defense against Michael Jordan in the 1990s. So why is basketball so well understood in other parts of the world as compared to the other sports? Well, a large role was played by missionaries and the YMCA and their efforts to go global. Basketball became a sport that when schools were established by missionaries in many parts of the world, and they wanted to play a sport. Those missionaries were familiar with the sport of basketball, and they sort of brought that to gym class. Similar situation with the YMCA. Its beginnings with Naismith, where he was worked at a YMCA. And so basketball sort of became part of the fabric of YMCA, and as it spread around the world, they took the sport with them. And introduced a lot of different countries and cultures to the sport of basketball. So it does have that grassroots foundation, unlike American football in other parts of the world. And also, beyond the grassroots, the Harlem Globetrotters, early on, even before the NBA became so popular, the Globetrotters were extremely popular and ambassadors for the United States, and traveled the world and played in other countries and were quite an attraction. The authors mention a note about a local team to us in northern Kentucky, the University of Kentucky, and the big role in 1966 of when Kentucky's team coached by Adolph Rupp lost to Texas Western University in the championship game. And Rupp's team was all white at the time. Texas Western University was all black, and that was a major point in basketball in terms of integration, or after that, the teams becoming much more integrated, and broke down some barriers, that victory by Texas Western in 1966. And so, beyond the Globetrotters, of course, Globetrotters are not quite as popular today as they were in the past, although they still travel the globe, including playing a couple games at our own Bank of Kentucky Center on our campus in Northern Kentucky. But what really popularized basketball, and specifically the NBA around the globe, was the Barcelona Olympics in 1992, which was the first time the NBA players played in the Olympics, and that was the Dream Team. And the whole world watched as they sort of rolled through the rest of the teams and sometimes even signed autographs for some of the opposing players after the game. Of course, Michael Jordan was a big part of that team, and he sort of ushered in the era of a global superstar and that pitched products not just in North America but around the globe, which helped to expand the awareness of basketball and the understanding of the language of basketball. Of course, Nike and his own Jordan brand being one of those products and probably the most popular product around the globe that Jordan was tied to. So where are the best leagues outside of the NBA? You'll find those in Spain, Italy, Greece, Israel, but there are several other leagues in addition to that that are at a relatively high level. And then we can think about the players as well and how the international players' integration into the NBA have spread the language of basketball and spread the popularity of the sport. Of course, Yao Ming comes to mind. He did a lot to make basketball in the NBA much more popular in China. We talked about the Nowitzki effect earlier in the semester. Dirk made the sport very, very popular in Germany. And also you have companies like AEG that have built NBA-style arenas around the world, and specifically most recently in China. The NBA has taken an interest in the Chinese Professional League in partnership with AEG, and we'll take some of our own teams here from the NBA over to China to play in those arenas, and then the normal or the regular tenant in those arenas is the professional team in China's top league. So when we think about this diffusion of sports culture and sports that are going international, one element that diffuses sports culture is the rise of super clubs. So in the U.S., we can think about the Yankees, we can think about the Lakers, perhaps the Celtics, the Bulls with Jordan, and the Dallas Cowboys. And in the rest of the world, they have Champions Leagues with their sports, where you have the champions from each of the domestic leagues in a particular country all come together and play in a Champions League. And the most popular one, of course, is soccer, but there's also a Champions League for rugby and for cricket as well. And the Champions League competitions really create this bridging capital where, taking soccer as an example, those games are played on Tuesday nights or Wednesdays, and you have people from all over Europe all watching the same games in the local pub or in their home, and it creates this bridging capital. So bridging meaning sports as sort of a capital that everybody follows, and it bridges countries together because you have people both in Spain and in say Holland all watching the same game, and it sort of gives you that commonality. And in some ways, the Super Bowl has become some bridging capital because it is carried all over the world, and it's probably the most famous, or it is the most famous North American sporting event that originates in North America, most famous around the world. The second globalization has also created this issue of spectating fans versus viewer fans. So a lot of fans of these so-called super clubs have never viewed the game or viewed their team live, but yet they watch from afar because they're able to do that because of media, the media proliferation. So they can watch a streaming game, or because of all the sports channels that they have via satellite TV, they can watch, they can spectate from afar, but they're not spectators in the actual stadium. So it brings up some consideration in terms of are spectators in the stadium bigger fans or any more loyal fans than those who are viewers through some sort of mediated method, be it the internet or satellite TV. And I think that those barriers have started to come down. you can now get information and be cognitively involved in your team by reading all about the clubs, beyond just watching the games. You can get all of the stats and all the information and the news stories at the same time as those spectators that are able to go to the games in that particular area. I can still get that information from the other side of the world because of the internet and our access to all of the material on the internet. And I did mention with the NBA that international players have become institutionalized. We're just used to it now in the NBA, and the same goes. The same phenomenon has happened in the NHL as well as Major League Baseball. But the NBA, especially with the popularity of the San Antonio Spurs or their success, and having players from several different countries all come together and play together and win championships. It's no longer unusual for foreign players to come into the league, and the backlash that existed initially with early players like Drazen Petrovic and Toni Kukoc, Detlef Schrempf from Germany. Some of that backlash a lot of that backlash has dissipated because it has been institutionalized now. And when those local boys or the person from a different culture comes to America and makes it big and becomes a global icon in our American league, it raises the popularity of that of the sport in that country. And then also, as I mentioned with Jordan earlier, when some of our American players become so big that they become global icons, and companies or brands use that player in their advertising in a particular country outside of the U.S., it also popularizes the sport or diffuses the sport. So that wraps up that element or that chapter on North American leagues trying to spread their leagues and become more international and kind of keep up with soccer. So at the same time that soccer is trying to grow its popularity in the U.S., our U.S. leagues, or our North American leagues, I should say, are trying to spread their wings and integrate or infiltrate, I should say, countries where soccer is the dominant sport.